Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dr. Brad Roberts, the director of the Center for Global Security Research, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion of the future of U.S.-China relations. This is a topic that needs no introduction. This has obviously risen to the top of our national discussion at this point. And we're grateful today to have Mr. Matt Turpin join us from the Hoover Institution to set out some arguments for us on this topic. He's a visiting fellow at Hoover. He's also a senior advisor to the Palantir Corporation. From 2018 to 2019, he served as senior director for China policy on the staff of the U.S. National Security Council. And he was, prior to that, serving in the U.S. Army, including a stint as an assistant professor at West Point. Matt's well known to our community. He's participated in numerous workshops of ours, and we're grateful to you, Matt, for carving out the time to join us today. Matt will speak for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll turn to Q&A. If you'd like to join that discussion, please raise your hand electronically, and I'll bring you in. Or you can send something in the chat function, and I'll try and get that into the conversation. Matt, thanks so much for making the time to do this. Over to you.
Brad, thanks so much. This is a real pleasure, and I am joining you from a rainy Washington, D.C., inside the Hoover Institution's D.C. offices downtown. So real pleasure to be with you. I do kind of wish I was out in California, where I suppose the weather is probably a little bit better than it is today here. So I wanted to spend kind of the next 30 to 40 minutes and kind of lay out a couple of sort of top-level topics about U.S.-China policy, and be able to sort of provide a bit of an overview and then transition into some questions. And so the three topics I was going to kind of focus my talk on was one, how did we get to the position that we are in U.S.-China relations from really a U.S. perspective? So sort of how did we get here? I want to discuss a little bit about what the Chinese leaders want, like what are they intending to do? What is their strategy for approaching not only the relationship with the United States, but broader international relations and China's place in the world? And then I want to cover a little forward-looking about sort of where do I think we go from here? And I don't necessarily want this to be sort of a normative discussion, but a discussion about what I think are the sort of the outlines of the potential options that U.S.-China policy has in front of it, and then what do those outlines look like, and what are the kinds of things we should then expect U.S.-China policy to sort of mean, and then we'll turn it over to questions. So first, maybe just a quick word on like how I got into this. I was just a regular Army officer serving out in the world. I took a position out at Pacific Command in 2010, where I focused on sort of planning for that combatant command as it looked at the region. And in so I got sort of sucked into U.S.-China policy just as the U.S. was beginning what was called at the time a pivot to Asia or a rebalance to Asia. This is when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had written her article in Foreign Affairs on a pivot to Asia. And so my story of being involved in these policy issues started then. And then I sort of moved back to D.C. into the Pentagon to work these issues for the last 4 years of the Obama administration. And then I went to the National Security Council and the Commerce Department during the Trump administration to work China policy, and then got out and have been involved in it from the outside. Once you sort of get sucked into these issues, it's increasingly hard to escape. It's a bit of a black hole and pulls us all in. And so I wanted to maybe lay out real quick, kind of give a quick historical overview of U.S.-China relations since the 1970s, and what I see is sort of three phases of U.S.-China policy, and sort of what are the outlines of that, and how to understand it. And so I think first of all, we should view the initial portion of the relationship between the U.S. And Beijing in the 1970s with the reestablishment of relations, or the establishment of relations with the People's Republic, as really through the lens of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States pursued a relationship with Beijing, and Beijing pursued a relationship with Washington, as a way to isolate the Soviet Union in a Cold War that the United States was waging, and had been waging for quite some time. It was to pull a key partner away from the Soviet Union, also to negotiate an end to the U.S. conflict in Vietnam. And the idea was that the relationship the United States would have with Beijing, that had already undergone a significant split between Moscow and Beijing, the United States would use that relationship as leverage against the Soviet Union. U.S.-China relations, the United States established listening posts across Xinjiang during this period of time, run by the NSA, which is just sort of in the last few years, details of that have begun to come out into the public record. The PRC was deeply involved in helping to ship weapons, primarily Chinese weapons early on, through Pakistan and into Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union, and to essentially be one of the suppliers that the U.S. relied upon for weapons to supply to the Mujahideen. And what you saw was an increasing sort of alignment between Beijing and Washington, in the late 1970s and into the 1980s, as we viewed the PRC as a Cold War partner against the Soviet Union. And so that sort of framing of the relationship meant that you had areas of security and intelligence cooperation happening, and you had budding economic cooperation that was beginning. Obviously, Beijing and the PRC was not yet the economic power that we know it to be today, but we saw some of those green shoots happening, and you started to see U.S. companies move into the PRC and establish operations there. By the end of the 1980s, I think we all are understanding that there's a couple of key things that happened that began to change that relationship. First you have the protests and massacre in Tiananmen Square, really protests that had taken place across China, starting in like April of 1989, which culminates in the June 4th massacre in Tiananmen, but also a crackdown across Chinese cities of not only students but regular Chinese citizens protesting against what they see as government corruption and an inability to be able to sort of to share the fruits of development that was happening across China. The United States was caught in many ways a bit flat-footed by this. One aspect that was happening at that exact same time is that Moscow and Beijing were beginning to reopen relations. Mikhail Gorbachev visits Beijing for his first Soviet leader to visit Beijing since the Sino-Soviet split in May of 1989. So the protests are happening against this backdrop of the first Soviet leaders visiting of the PRC, and from a George H.W. Bush administration's perspective, they're looking at the relationship with the PRC through the lens of the Cold War. They see a thawing of relations between Moscow and Beijing, and are seeking to ensure that this Cold War partnership stays in place, and therefore they take a relatively light hand approach to reacting to the crackdown and massacre on June 4th, and that sort of sets up a set of dilemmas across the U.S. government to relook at the relationship with Beijing as 1989, 1990, and 1991 play out, as we all know, right? Obviously, by the end of the year, you have the collapse of the Berlin Wall. You've got the disintegration of communist power across Eastern Europe, and by 1991, you have the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so under that construct, what you really have is this transition from this sort of first phase of US-China relations, really a Cold War partnership, into the next phase of the US-China relationship. And it's up for grabs on what that relationship should be. You have a Clinton administration that comes in that had run on a platform of condemning the George H.W. Bush administration for being soft on the PRC over the massacre. President Clinton is famously known for wanting to hold the butchers of Beijing responsible, and is putting significant pressure on the Bush administration to cut off its ties to Beijing as these weeks are happening. But you have a series of discussions within the new Clinton administration, and by May of 1994, we begin to see the outlines of what I would consider to be the second phase of U.S.-China relations, and that is a phase that I would call engagement, and it's really about using economic development to drive political liberalization, and this essentially this policy gets announced in May of 1994 in a speech by President Clinton at Johns Hopkins University, in which he lays out essentially that while there are a number of things that we object to that are happening in the PRC, Deng Xiaoping and other Chinese leaders appear to be willing to partake in the kinds of economic reforms that the United States welcomes, and the United States will partner with China to help them through these economic development and economic reforms, with the assumption on the U.S.'s part is that, of course, this will lead to the kind of political liberalization that we'd want to see. And of course, it's all within the backdrop of the collapse of communism across Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. And so really, for U.S. policymakers, this is simply a matter of time that the same outcome will happen across the PRC. And of course, the United States had followed this concept of using economic development to drive political liberalization in other countries. It had been doing this in the 1980s with South Korea, that had transitioned from really an authoritarian dictatorship in the 1980s, where you'd had a military coup, to the end of the 1980s, when you start to have agreements by South Korean leaders to begin to reinstitute democracy. And that's really by holding those economic ties, really incentives and incentivizing the South Korean government to do the same. We have the same sort of things playing out in Taiwan and the Republic of China. 1987, the Republic of China ends martial law in Taiwan. And by 1995, you have the first presidential democratic elections being held, in which the KMT is now competing against other political parties that they had once outlawed. And so you have these sort of trends that are happening across Asia, but we're also watching it across Europe, of sort of using economic development to drive this political liberalization. And it's a set of policies that we then graft onto the PRC with really an expectation of what's going to happen, right? That is, even if Chinese Communist Party leaders want to hold on to power, as Chinese citizens become wealthier and more exposed to the world, they will demand political changes. And as we've seen with other Communist Party regimes, they are going to be unable to hold back the tide of what their citizens want. And this is sort of the broad-based assumption of what we would see. Certainly for many close watchers of the PRC, there are serious questions of whether this will work. But of course, there's a broader sort of milieu in which this policy is being adopted. And that policy, in many ways, works extremely well. It works extremely well in providing the kinds of economic developments and technological advancements that within 2 decades. So the adoption of this is sort of in May of 1994, and certainly by 2010, 2012, we have seen an economic miracle take place across China, a raising of living standards, and China has become deeply enmeshed in sort of the global economy, and has become much wealthier and much more technologically advanced. But what we don't see by that period of time, by 2010, 2014, is we don't see the political liberalization. What we actually see is a backsliding of liberalization that had begun to take root in certain areas, but that by the time that Xi Jinping comes to power, really the end of Hu Jintao's reign and the beginning of Xi Jinping's reign, which is sort of 2012, 2013, we see a serious backsliding in the kinds of political liberalizations and political reforms, and that the Chinese Communist Party is beginning to take advantage of the economic and technological and industrial power that is built through its partnerships with the United States, Europe, Japan, and others, and transforming that into the greater ability to control and keep the PRC under the firm control of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's what begins to lead to really another transition for U.S. policy, which is a transition from this policy of engagement to one which I would consider to be really Cold War rivalry. And it starts really about this point in time of the transition from Hu Jintao to Xi Jinping, as China becomes more assertive in the world and challenging U.S. positions across the Indo-Pacific, but also as American businesses and others begin to observe that the kind of reform and opening that they had hoped to see and the kinds of business opportunities that they had hoped to achieve inside the Chinese market, in many ways those are not being realized, and they're being replaced by Chinese companies that are helped by the Chinese Communist Party and the broader PRC state to be able to enable those companies to be able to replace their foreign competitors. And so you start to have a souring on that approach to engagement, both from a political side, from those who had hoped to see economic reforms driving political liberalization. As those dreams start to get dashed on reality, you also have a business community that is also disappointed with the outcomes that they're seeing, and they're seeing that it's much more difficult for them to operate inside the Chinese economy, and they're beginning to witness and deal with Chinese competitors in third markets or back in their home markets. And that begins really a process of U.S. businesses coming to the United States government asking for sort of a much stronger enforcement of some of the trade rules that have been in place since China's entry into the WTO, but had largely been sort of observed in the breach. And that begins a process really in the last 2 years of the Obama administration to really rethink U.S. policy on China. That lines up with the transition from the Obama administration into the Trump administration, but it reflects really a bipartisan shifting in the expectations the United States has of its relationship with the PRC. And so what you see is essentially a set of policies that was likely to be implemented by a President Hillary Clinton administration starting in January of 2017, which actually gets picked up by a Donald Trump administration, so much so that by the end of 2017, you have a national security strategy that recognizes the PRC as a strategic competitor and really calls China out as a rival of the United States in ways that had not been used in the preceding 25 years. And that sort of signaled this transition to a new set of policies around the United States. And that is sort of where we are today, as we are in this sort of developing and an increasingly hostile rivalry between the United States and the PRC that I expect will continue to play out over time. So that's sort of a quick rundown of the history of where we are. I want to quick cover what I think Beijing wants. What are they trying to achieve? What are Chinese leaders trying to achieve? And first of all, I think it's important to sort of differentiate. I mean, to say that what does China want is a bit of obviously China is not an individual person. It is made up of multitudes. You've got a variety of points of view and perspectives. But of course, it is ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. And the Chinese Communist Party, while obviously not monolithic, it intends to be monolithic in its policies and the way in which it carries out its its policies, right? It seeks in true sort of Leninist format, it seeks to erase factionalism and to ensure that you have agreement across the party line and that you have alignment between the party's leadership of the country and what then the country follows, and that there is, in many ways, no brokering of disagreements of what the policies that the country should follow. Really, Xi Jinping comes back into power and really focuses his time and energy on rebuilding the institutions of the Chinese Communist Party to take over control of the entire Chinese state and gain control of broader Chinese society in ways that had been degraded, certainly since Mao's Cultural Revolution had destroyed the sort of foundational aspects of the Chinese Communist Party, and what had sort of degenerated during the period of reform and opening, and both Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, who did not spend as much time and energy building out the foundations of the Chinese Communist Party in a truly Leninist sort of way, right? A Leninist way of essentially making sure that the party does not have factions, that you essentially have a strong leader that sets the course, and that strong leader makes the decisions and everyone else follows from that. And that is really what the sort of the efforts that Xi Jinping, as he comes into power, seeks to do. And if you were to lay out sort of what is his main vision for what Beijing achieves, he looks at he sees himself as sort of the third manifestation of Chinese Communist Party leaders. Mao Zedong helped China stand up. Deng Xiaoping helped China become rich. And now Xi Jinping sees that China will take over its rightful place as the world's primary power, that it is the one that is going to then set the rules for how the world operates, return China to its sort of rightful place as the world's largest power, right? That Xi Jinping views that China lost in the 19th century with a collapse of power by the Qing dynasty and really the abuse of Western imperialists, not only Russia, but obviously Western European powers that had carved up Asia during a period of imperialism, and that Xi Jinping's role will be to return China to a position of greatness and running an international system. He views this as this great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. He sees this as the common mission that he has laid out for the country. He has sort of built the Chinese Communist Party, rebuilt the Chinese Communist Party to focus on those objectives. And he has begun to sort of reinstitute a set of ideologies to reanimate the party around this this mission of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, something that is called Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. I know that's a mouthful, but that is the entire title of it. It's a set of it's an ideology. It's meant to be placed on par with Mao Zedong thought, and essentially to be able to sort of lay out that as China moves into this new era, the new era in which it retakes its rightful place as the globe's primary power, that the Chinese state, under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, will be the one that reforms those relations, not only with internally within Chinese society, but within the relationship that China has with its neighbors and the rest of the world. It sees the United States as its primary obstacle in achieving those objectives. It talks, the party and Xi Jinping, talk constantly about a struggle that they have, and that there are either hostile foreign forces or capitalist forces that stand in the way of China achieving the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And therefore, they have not only created for themselves sort of internally this idea that they have a foreign adversary, but then they are able to use the existence of a foreign adversary to be able to explain why the Chinese people don't have the kinds of things that they would expect to have from terms of economic development. And so that has continued to be sort of the process. This shift in portraying the United States as its primary obstacle and adversary certainly didn't begin with Xi Jinping. We could see Jiang Zemin back in the late 1990s laying this out, particularly around the Third Taiwan Strait Crisis, 1995, 1996, that the United States is standing in the way of achieving the unification with Taiwan. Deng Xiaoping certainly blamed the United States as essentially being the black hand behind the Tiananmen Square protests. It's the United States instigating these things. And we see this same language coming from the current leaders as they look at the protests in Hong Kong are portrayed as being inspired and guided by the United States. And so that's a common theme that we watch moving across. I'm going to transition to sort of the last point here on sort of where do things go from here. And I wanted to be, I wanted to avoid sort of a normative discussion, like what do I think should happen? And I wanted to sort of discuss and lay out what are the things that could happen. What are the options that are sort of available from a policy perspective of sort of where things are. So I think I put them into sort of three categories. The first is a grand bargain. This idea that the United States and the PRC will come to some sort of grand bargain of how to settle differences between each other. From Beijing's perspective, this would look like a sphere of influence and kind of a G2 relationship, that the United States and the PRC would divide up the world and that the two great powers would interact with one another to resolve differences. This was an idea that Xi Jinping first laid out to President Obama in the summer of 2013, called New Type Great Power Relations. This is what he laid out at the Sunnyland Summit, the first meeting of the two leaders, and it essentially is a G2 relationship in which the United States and the PRC create spheres of influence for each other. That's one sort of outcome, and I think it's the outcome that Beijing thinks is the outcome that it would most prefer. Right? It is its preferred outcome. Sort of the next outcome is a relative detente, and you can see this kind of coming about as both the United States and the PRC and the rest of the world have increased economic challenges, and there are sort of multimodal threats that are existing in the world. Both Beijing and Washington could agree to essentially a form of a detente to essentially buy time until either power feels they're in a stronger position to be able to press their advantages on the other. And you could see that kind of come about. So that's, I think, a second option of what we could see. And I think the third option is an escalating Cold War rivalry that would play out in which each one views the other as its principal rival and seeks to disadvantage the other. And under that scenario, I think what you would see is sort of an increased disentanglement of each other's economies as each side seeks to protect itself from vulnerabilities by the other. As I would make a prediction of what I think is likely to happen, is I suspect that this third scenario is the most likely scenario. Certainly there has been talk of a grand bargain, but the conceptions that both Washington and Beijing have for what that grand bargain would be, I think there is a large distance between what each side would expect that they could achieve in that grand bargain and what they would come to agree to. And so I think while each side may want to do that, I think it's highly unlikely that it will actually come about. I also think that it's unlikely that each side will seek a détente with the other, and that we are far more likely to see further escalation as this relationship becomes more hostile. And that means, and I describe this as a Cold War, and I really point to this from George Orwell's conception of a Cold War. George Orwell coined the term Cold War in an essay that he wrote 2 months after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And essentially what he laid out is that the existence of nuclear weapons by great powers, great powers that possess nuclear weapons essentially make each other unconquerable. And in doing so, it pushes the competition and the rivalry between great powers into domains other than direct military conflict. And so what you see then is battles over technology. You see battles over trade and economic activities. You see battles over propaganda and information and influence. And you see proxy wars pop up in which each side, essentially fights their battles in other domains against their principal rival. Right. This is the outline of the Soviet American Cold War. And I think we're watching a Sino-American Cold War slip into that same dynamic. An interest by both sides to avoid direct military conflict because of the escalation risk and the impacts that nuclear weapons has on both sides. But each side seeks to gain an advantage against the other and seeks to pull partners and find proxy wars in which they can fight. And I think that is likely the situation that we will find ourselves in. And the time that likely changes is probably when you have leadership transitions in Beijing. I think from a U.S. side, what we've now witnessed is sort of a general consensus across both parties that we view the PRC as our principal rival, and which means that it's really leadership transitions in Beijing when Xi Jinping steps down, in which you would have an opportunity to be able to change that dynamic. I think it's unlikely to change while Xi Jinping is in power. He has laid out a series of decisions. I don't know about you, but most 70-year-olds that I know rarely change their minds after they've already had a number of policies that they've put in place for 15 years, and so we're unlikely to see those sorts of things change. So that's kind of my set of predictions, and I'm happy to take your questions.